Number 10. Gonzalo Lopez. As a high-risk inmate serving a life sentence at a Texas prison, convicted murderer Gonzalo Lopez was put in both hand and leg restraints whenever he was transported outside of the prison. He was also locked in a special cage within the vehicle. Yet he still somehow managed to escape during a ride to a medical appointment in 2022 by breaking out of his restraints and cutting his way out of the cage while fellow inmates distracted the driver and another officer. Lopez attacked the driver, and a lengthy struggle ensued between the two as they fell out of the bus and continued to fight on the ground. At some point, he managed to get back on the bus and drive away, while the driver and officer shot at him and the vehicle's tires. After getting just a mile down the road, Lopez wrecked the bus. He slipped out of sight and vanished into the wilderness on foot. The highly dangerous fugitive was still on the run 3 weeks later when he murdered a 67-year-old grandfather and 4 of the man's grandchildren. He stole some guns from the home and fled the scene in the victim's truck. Police set spike strips in an attempt to capture Lopez, who kept driving even after running over the spikes. He drove through a field and began shooting at officers from behind the wheel when he lost control of the truck and crashed into a utility pole. Lopez continued to shoot at the police, leaving them with no choice but to return fire. He died in the shootout. His escape left many wondering how an inmate managed to bypass such heavy security measures and make his way past 2 armed guards. Consequently, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice implemented some changes to prevent a similar catastrophe from ever happening. Number 9. Jessica BOOMERSHINE. In early 2020, Jessica BOOMERSHINE and Billy Joe Farah abducted an 85-year-old man they met at a casino in Montgomery County, Ohio. They broke into the victim's home and forced the senior citizen to give up his ATM card and PIN at gunpoint. The couple then forced the man into the trunk of his car, withdrew money from an ATM, and abandoned the vehicle. The victim pulled the emergency release lever inside the trunk and sought help from workers at a nearby waste management facility. Police soon found BOOMERSHINE and Farah and took them into custody. While awaiting the next step of the booking process, BOOMERSHINE attempted to escape through the ceiling. But the tiles failed to hold under her weight, and she came crashing through to the floor. She was unharmed, but did major damage to the ceiling. She took a plea deal for her crimes and is currently serving a 25 to 30-year sentence, which is significantly less than the amount of time she could have faced if she went to trial. Number 8. Blaine and Susan Barksdale. 72-year-old Frank Bly disappeared in 2019 following a fire at his Tucson home. His body was nowhere to be found, but authorities ruled his death a homicide. By the time they identified Blaine and Susan Barksdale as their prime suspects, the couple had fled the area. The U.S. Marshals Service tracked them down more than 2,000 miles, 3,219 kilometers away, in Rochester, New York, and hired a private security contractor to return them to Arizona. While being transported through Utah in a prison van, Susan Barksdale claimed that she urgently needed to use the bathroom, and the driver pulled over. The Barksdales then attacked the 2 unarmed guards supervising the vehicle. They tied the guards up and put them in the back of the van with a 3rd prisoner who wasn't involved in the escape. The couple drove the van to an acquaintance's house in Arizona, where Blaine took a friend's pickup truck. Susan continued to drive the van until they reached the middle of the desert, where she abandoned it with all 3 captives inside. Luckily, the keys were still in the van when the trio broke free hours later and made their way to a sheriff's office. But the amount of time it took for them to notify anyone of the escape gave the Barksdales an 8-hour head start. They were nowhere to be found, despite a statewide search generating hundreds of tips. But the couple's life on the run only lasted a few weeks before authorities found them in an isolated remote enclave and finally got them behind bars. Blaine received a 22-year prison sentence for murder, and Susan was sentenced to 5 years for manslaughter. Number 7. Sean Bush and Roger Rios. One day in October 2022, staff at the Pima County Jail in Arizona discovered 31-year-old Sean Bush and 26-year-old Roger Rios suffering from what appeared to be a drug overdose. The 2 inmates were transported to a local hospital. While there, Rios reportedly leapt out of his bed and tried to flee his room. Staff noticed right away, given the increased level of law enforcement that one can expect at a hospital where 2 prisoners are being treated. Rios was apprehended so quickly that Bush didn't even have an opportunity to try escaping. Both men were taken back to jail. Local authorities said that heightened security measures were being implemented following the incident to prevent any similar close calls from happening. Number 6. David Watson. David Watson was being unloaded from a prisoner van at a high-security psychiatric hospital in Maryland in 2017 when he shoved a guard to the ground and ran off into the wilderness. The 28-year-old, who was serving a 100-year sentence for the attempted murder of a police officer, had somehow freed himself from handcuffs and a waist chain. He managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement despite fleeing with nothing more than the clothes on his back. Numerous reported sightings were called in, including one that described a man in a construction hat and vest who was seen running. Watson stole the items from a nearby storage building. Then the discarded hat and vest were found later that day. After concluding that Watson was no longer in the immediate area, the U.S. Marshals Service took over the case and offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who might have information leading to the convict's whereabouts. Using night vision technology, a team found him hiding in an 18-inch, 45.7-centimeter drain pipe in a wooded area. Watson surrendered without incident and was locked back up. Number 5. Juan Fidencio Romo de la Rosa. 39-year-old Juan Fidencio Romo de la Rosa was serving an 8-year federal prison sentence in the U.S. for illegally trafficking human migrants when he attempted to break out in 2020. Guards at the medium security facility in Beaumont, Texas, first noticed that something was wrong when a fence alarm went off. Officers rushed outside to find De La Rosa trying to climb the fence. He was injured and bloody from coming into contact with barbed wire, but was nevertheless determined to flee. By then, he had already gotten past an interior fence and was in the process of trying to scale an outer fence. De La Rosa surrendered to the guards at gunpoint and was charged for the attempted escape. He received an additional sentence of 27 months, lengthening his stay by more than 2 years. Number 4. Michael Brady. In what would tragically become known as North Carolina's deadliest attempted prison breakout, 4 inmates fatally stabbed and bludgeoned 2 guards, a maintenance worker and a sewing plant manager in 2017. Disturbing footage of the incident shows the convicts standing over the motionless victims with hammers and scissors in their hands. The prisoners tried to leave, but dozens of guards sprang into action. They surrendered just outside the facility. At the crime scene, investigators found pre-packed survival bags that the inmates planned on using in the event that their escape was successful. At the time, the state was experiencing a severe prison staffing shortage, forcing employees to take shortcuts that put their own safety at risk. Workers were also suffering from burnout and complacency, according to a National Institute of Corrections report. Consequently, staff members failed to keep accurate track of the prisoners' inventory of tools and dangerous chemicals. Doors were left unlocked, and inmates had an opportunity to take things without anyone noticing. Michael Brady, who had a lengthy criminal record dating back to his teens and was serving a 25-year sentence for attempted murder, was the first of the 4 suspects to go on trial. Jurors saw footage of him telling investigators that he was motivated to commit the attempted breakout because he was upset about his sentence and felt like he had nothing to lose. The defense brought up Brady's difficult childhood, which was reportedly fraught with abuse and mental health issues, but the jury apparently didn't see this as a viable explanation for his actions or for going easy on him in any way. After deliberating for just a half hour, they voted to convict him on a laundry list of charges, including murder and attempted escape. Brady was sentenced to death for his crimes. The remaining 3 suspects have yet to go on trial. They're accused of planning the escape for months ahead of time and are also facing murder charges. Number 3. Wasan Asaye. While being treated at a Fairfax, Virginia hospital in 2015, suspected serial bank robber Wasan Asaye watched and waited until a guard took a bathroom break. The 42-year-old somehow slipped out of his shackles, stole a gun from a second guard, and fled on foot in his hospital gown. Asaye was in federal custody on suspicion of robbing 12 banks and using a bicycle as a getaway vehicle each time, showing that he was already a seasoned pro when it came to evading law enforcement. Following his escape, authorities embarked on a 9-hour manhunt, deploying hundreds of officers and dogs, along with a helicopter. After allegedly stealing 2 cars, Asaye was spotted on a Washington, D.C. bus, where a civilian recognized him and tipped off the police. The police said it was incredibly fortunate that nobody got hurt during the escapee's short-lived time on the run. Asaye was sentenced to 32 years in prison for his crimes, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. Number 2. Darko Desik. Sometimes a seemingly flawless jailbreak backfires years or even decades later. Over 30 years ago, 35-year-old Darko Desik was sentenced to 33 months in an Australian prison for growing marijuana. He escaped in 1992 by using a hacksaw blade to cut through the window of his cell and a crowbar to get past the prison's fence. One of the main motivations for Desik's escape was the fear that he would be deported to Yugoslavia once he finished serving his time. At the time, there was a brutal war going on as Yugoslavia's republics fought for their independence from communist dictatorship. Desik was afraid of being forced to fight or detained in conditions far worse than he stood to experience at an Australian prison. He managed to avoid detection over the years while working as a handyman in Sydney's beach communities. But when the COVID-19 pandemic hit and forced everyone into lockdown, he found himself without an income. He turned himself into law enforcement and admitted to his escape from decades earlier. He was sent to prison to serve the 14 remaining months on his sentence, plus 2 months for the escape. By then, Yugoslavia was no longer a country, begging the question of what would happen to Desik, who still faced deportation. If a country that now exists in place of Yugoslavia agreed to accept him, that's likely where he would go. He's afraid to return to a place he doesn't know, and of the consequences he could suffer there for any of his perceived wrongdoings. The local community is standing behind Desik as his lawyer fights to get his case commuted, which would enable him to stay in Australia. But for now, his future remains uncertain. Number 1. Frank Freshwaters. After receiving a suspended 20-year prison sentence for a deadly hit-and-run in 1957, 22-year-old Frank Freshwaters violated his probation and was thrown back behind bars to serve out the rest of his sentence at an Ohio penitentiary. He escaped a couple of years later and obtained a new identity under the name William Harold Cox, the same name he was using when police in West Virginia responded to a call about a domestic incident in 1975. They found a fugitive hiding under his kitchen sink. In an unlikely stroke of luck, the state governor refused to extradite Freshwaters to Ohio. He was released from custody and disappeared again. The case was more or less forgotten about until 2015, when the 56-year-old case was reopened. U.S. Marshals traced the convict's alias to a trailer park outside Melbourne, Florida, where undercover agents tricked him into signing some paperwork. They tested his prints, and sure enough, it was a match to Freshwaters' case from decades earlier. The 79-year-old was transported to Ohio and put back in prison, probably the last place any senior citizen wants to be. He faced a potential of remaining locked up until age 97, meaning he could very well spend the rest of his life in prison. Freshwaters' lawyers argued to the parole board that he had lived mostly on the straight and narrow during his more than half-century on the run, and he was paroled in 2016. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live near a prison with a history of escapes, or on a remote property miles from the nearest police station, where you're generally very safe, but where it would take at least 45 minutes for help to arrive if you really needed it? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.